Okay, so let's get underway. So, when we look at the body of work that Swedenborg recorded and forms the doctrines for the new church, we find perhaps one of the most comprehensive psycho-spiritual mappings of the human mind ever produced. And of course, it's a record of spiritual exploration, and it lays out the inner terrain of the true hero's journey. And it's a journey that every human being is called to undertake. So we have the map. And while the map is not the territory, to use an old cliche, this map has a divine origin. And that gives it a property that no other map has. So it is, for want of a better term, psychoactive. It not only describes the terrain, it actively brings it into being as we engage with it. And its highest use is to restructure the mind into a heavenly form. And that is what Logopraxis recognizes by placing the word and the experience of the word at the center of the work we undertake. So if you're working with truths from the word, examining yourself, shunning evils as sins against the Lord, the text is already reshaping your mind and your experience of spiritual life. And it does this on the deepest levels of our being. So the text or the word penetrates right to the very core of ourself. So in Heaven and Hell, numbers 491 to 520, Swedenborg describes three states that a spirit moves through upon awakening from death. Now, a surface reading gives us a first-hand account of what to expect when the physical body dies. But our focus throughout these presentations is not on that literal event. As with all things spiritual, the same principles that govern one level of reality govern every level. The principles may be clothed differently, but essentially they are the same. So the awakening from death described in Heaven and Hell is simultaneously a description of your awakening to spiritual life here and now. An awakening from the death of proprial existence through the practice of the word. It's just a fact that without dying to the self we claim as our own, life is not possible. Without death, there is no resurrection. And of course, resurrection means to awaken from death. So Heaven and Hell invites us to hold that meaning at the level of our own inner life, not only at the level of the physical body. And we have what the Lord said in Matthew 16:25, "For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." So as we move through these sessions, try to hold both levels in mind, the literal account the text offers and the spiritual application to your own life in the present. So if you take a look at the image on this slide, what we have is a layered interlocking sphere. And this speaks to the idea that spiritual awakening is not a linear journey from some point A to some point B. But for simplicity's sake, it is often presented as such. Rather, this inward journey is a journey that takes us through successive layers of the self, each one revealing something more essential and closer to how things actually are. That's the nature of the map we're beginning to look into today. So for this series of presentations, the arc is as follows. This first presentation gives the complete overview, the whole map, and subsequent sessions will zoom into each of the three phases in depth. So let's begin with the foundational premise that makes all this possible. So this slide that we have here states perhaps what is considered a radical claim, but I don't think it really should be. But that claim is that the Word is the Lord. So this is what Logopraxis holds as its center. And this is not meant metaphorically or symbolically, but actually. So the Word is the Lord himself, present in the world in the form of sacred text. And the Word and all it contains is what is meant by the term logos. So just reading from a work called Doctrine of the Lord, number 2, we have this. We can see clearly that the specific word meant here is the word made known through Moses, the prophets, and the evangelists, since this is the actual divine truth from which angels get all their wisdom, and from which we get our spiritual intelligence. In fact, angels in the heavens have the very same word that we have in the world, though for us, in the world, it is earthly, while in the heavens it is spiritual. Further, since it is divine truth, the word is also something divine that is emanating, and this is not only from the Lord, but is the Lord himself. So what follows from that claim, if we think it through, is nothing short of remarkable. If the word is the Lord, then engaging with it is not just an intellectual exercise. It's an encounter, or at least a potential encounter. And that encounter has consequences. The word becomes, in the language of Logopraxis, psychoactive, in that it actively restructures the human mind in the act of applying it to our mental states. The practice of the word is the basis by which we can be given a new mind, and this new mind is what is meant by a new church. So the practical mechanism that brings about this transformation is illustrated by this slide. So central to the process is the practice of the word, for it is only as we engage with truths for the purpose for which they are given that a new relationship between the external sensory experience of life and the activity of the natural mind can be established. When we consciously work with the word, we enter into what might be called liminal space, or that threshold between worlds. So you see here on the left we have external life, and the literal text falls into that realm. And on the right we have the psychic contents of the natural mind. Now what the practice of the word enables is the illumination or the drawing out into our awareness the hidden thoughts or those patterns of thinking and feeling that we are barely aware of, that sit almost like white noise below the threshold of our everyday awareness. Through the practice of the word, or logos, these things are brought into light. The ruling affections are revealed, and the true nature of the infernal will is gradually exposed. And we are given a direct experience of the power of the word as the Lord working in our life to reveal what needs to be seen. But what is it that transforms our experience of the text? How do we move from reading the text as information about an objective spiritual world out there somewhere to a direct experience of that world within as our own mental life? Logopraxis asks us to read the letter of the word, but to think correspondentially, which means to think in terms of states of mind and their changes. So thinking spiritually means to think in terms of mental structures and processes. Mental structures are things like the beliefs we hold, those beliefs that we actually live from, the attitudes we hold, the values, And mental processes deal with how the affections and thoughts related to these structures undergo change. So when we use the text as the basis for our spiritual life in the here and now, we come to see that trees in the text are not trees. Hills are not hills. Mountains are not mountains. Nothing is what the natural mind takes it to be. We need to remember that the text describes the spiritual world, or mental states in the language of the natural world. Now, this isn't done to make things difficult. It's done so that those of us who think naturally might have a relatable starting point of entry into deeper things. Nothing described in the text belonging to the spiritual world is as it appears, for a simple reason. The spiritual world is the world of your mind. It is a mental world whose two fundamental constituents are love and wisdom, affections and thoughts, not as in the material world, space and time. Spiritual thought lives and moves in a world where everything speaks to the active affections and thoughts that make up the prevailing state of mind. Where natural thinking is fixed on space and time and its objects, spiritual thinking is focused on what space and time correspond to: love and wisdom, goods and truths. Space and time simply do not exist for spiritual thought. To think spiritually so that we can engage with the Word, and even more importantly, so that the Word can work in us to bring our minds into a regenerated form, requires a kind of thought in which material ideas serve as a foundation rather than a framework. They are the ground we think from, not the medium we think in. And since the spiritual world is nothing other than the world of mind, Logopraxis invites us to read by removing material ideas, ideas of person, place, space, and time, replacing them with what they correspond to spiritually. So if we treat this as a practice and look to the Lord as the Word to direct our work, we will find ourselves before levels of meaning that reveal how the text can be applied to our mental states here and now. To think in terms of states of mind is what it means to think spiritually. So when we strip away the historical, geographical, and biographical overlays of a surface reading, looking instead to apply what we find directly to the life of our mind, we are brought face to face with the quality of what's arising in our mental landscape. We become present to our states of mind, or stated another way, we become aware of the spirits associated with us that manifest as familiar patterns of feeling and thinking. All of this is governed by the Word, which takes us inward in order to see what it is that stands against the life of heaven. John 1:1-4 is the touchstone. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was toward God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light that the Word casts is specifically a light on the inner life of the human mind. That is its acknowledged primary function in Logopraxis. So, when we engage with the Word in our practice, and we notice something happening inside, that the text is describing what's happening within us rather than just a historical event, that recognition, that moment of this is about the inner world, about my mental landscape, is the Word becoming psychoactive. So having looked at this premise, that the word is the Lord. Let's now look at the overall architecture of what this psychoactive encounter with the word produces in us. So this slide shows the three phases of awakening as a simple linear flow. Each phase builds on the previous one so that, in that sense, the journey moves progressively inward. So we see that phase one involves an examination of the self-image, the stripping back of the moral and civil mask that conceals the deeper nature of the infernal proprium. Phase two, the state of interiors, involves coming to terms with the true nature of that proprium, the sense of self we have taken ourselves to be. And phase three, the state of instruction, is the final phase of preparation before entering into a new, heavenly sense of self. Now, this threefold pattern has a fractal quality to it. You see it operating at every level. It maps the awakening of spirits described in heaven and hell, as we see here. It also describes our own awakening to spiritual life in the here and now. And you can also see it in the 2-week cycle of a Logopraxis session. Firstly, we come to the letter of the word, we read it, we are engaging at an external level. Once we find a truth and begin to apply that to our lives, so we move deeper, and what is deeper within starts to become visible. And then we bring that experience to the life group, where both you and the group receive instruction through the sharing that takes place. So the journey of the spirit is not merely a post-death event, but a present tense psychological restructuring through the integration of the word into our life. So there are two things that are worth underlining. First, you cannot bypass these states. Heaven and hell describes not what might happen, but what must happen. No one leaps from phase one to phase three through intellectual understanding or pure force of will, any more than a child can decide to skip from infancy to adulthood. Each state must reach its own completion before the next opens. Second, notice that the movement is inward, then outward. Phase one works on the surface, the exterior self-image. Phase two goes deep into the ruling loves that drive our life. Phase three moves outward again, but now from a center that has been transformed and orientated toward the common good or the good of the whole. So heaven and hell names these three phases as states. Phase one is the state of exteriors, and that's heaven and hell 491 to 498. And through that particular state, the focus is on the moral and civil masks. These are exposed and removed and stripped back. Phase two is termed the state of interiors. These run from heaven and hell 499 to 511. And this is the unveiling of the infernal proprium, coming to terms and seeing that what truths describe it as is in fact true. Phase three is termed the state of instruction. That's found in heaven and hell 512 to 520. And this phase involves truth being integrated into our life. And what that means is it means becoming a use or a form of charity that works for the good of the whole. So each phase has its own unique function, its own characteristic struggles, and its own markers of completion. And over the course of this series, we will map each one in detail. So let's look now at the first phase, the one most of us live in most of the time. So the first phase is the state of exteriors. So this is the first state spirits enter upon arriving in the spiritual world. And as its name suggests, it's concerned with the more external aspects of our mental life. It is also that first level addressed when we begin to awaken to spiritual life through the practice of the Word. Now, we all carry a moral and civil exterior, and it's largely learnt behaviour that forms an overlay concealing a host of unexamined affections and thoughts running continuously below the surface. It is the face we present to the world in conformity with societal expectations, and it holds in check the deeper drives that issue from the loves of self and the world. But it also creates a false sense of security, the quiet conviction that while I may not be perfect, I'm certainly not that bad. Now, beneath this facade, the proprium operates from a central falsehood, and that is that we live from ourselves, that our life is self-generated, that we are autonomous, independent beings. And this belief gives shape to everything that makes up our identity. In fact, we are so invested in it that until we commit to examining ourselves through truths from the Word, we barely register the darker patterns at work beneath the surface. So Heaven and Hell 498 makes an uncompromising claim, and it states that in the spiritual world, no one may think and will one way while speaking and acting another. Everyone must be an image of their own affection. The exterior must correspond to the interior. So this is a spiritual law, not a preference. And what the first state does is begin to enforce it, not harshly, not all at once, but gradually. The persona we have built up from childhood, the face of friendliness and sincerity we maintain in company, begins to be questioned. For Logopraxis practitioners, this is the experience of discovering I am not who I thought I was. A truth from the Word illuminates a response we had, an attitude we held, a pattern we never noticed, and suddenly the self-image cracks. The teachings are frank about this. It is often a painful process described in terms of vestations, and its length is proportional to the depth of attachment we have to a false self-image. But it's worth saying clearly, this disruption is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something has begun. The exterior mind is being prepared to serve as a faithful channel for interior things. Disruption is the beginning of bringing the internal and external into a correspondence. So one of the most significant areas where this exterior reshaping happens is in our relationships. So this first state, referred to as the state of external concerns, that name points to something important about where we begin. When we first come to the practice, we arrive more often than not with our own preconceived ideas about what needs addressing. We have not yet learnt to trust the Word to identify what actually requires attention. And so we still operate from an inverted picture of spiritual reality, the one illustrated on the left of this slide. Now, the natural assumption drawn from sensory experience is that external events cause our inner states. Someone says something unkind, and that's why we feel hurt or angry. A relationship breaks down, and that is why we feel lost. This diagram on the left captures this. The external event leads to inner pain, leads to a reaction. That's how things appear. It is a causal chain that places all the power in the external world. The Logopraxis view, grounded in what the word teaches about cause and effect, fundamentally reframes this. The external event does not cause the inner state, it reveals it. The spotlight falls on something that was already there, an unconscious affection, a hidden attachment, a love lodged in us beneath the level of awareness. The event merely brings it to the surface where it can be seen and worked with. So this shift has profound implications. It means we stop trying to manage or control external circumstances as the primary strategy, and instead place our trust in the Word and look inward at the states being revealed. A difficult relationship, a colleague who irritates us, a spouse whose habits grate, a friend who disappoints. All this becomes spiritual material, a lens through which our own inner landscape is made visible to us. In this first phase, our attention is still heavily drawn outward to the people and circumstances of our life. The practice of the Word begins to redirect it. What affection in me is this event revealing? What attachment, what love, what fear? This is not a call to ignore relationships or dismiss the real needs of others. It is a call to recognize that the only place genuine change is possible is in our own inner response, and that the Word, not the management of circumstances, is what gives us access to it. So moving now into the second phase, where the work goes much deeper. Heaven and Hell 499 describes it this way, speaking of a spirit. He is then led into the interiors of his mind, that is, of his will and thought, while his exteriors, which he has been in during this first state, are laid asleep. The exterior of the mind, the social self, the persona, is set aside, and what remains is the unfiltered interior. And what does that interior contain? Well, we find a self beset with unacknowledged anger, contempt, self-justification, merit-seeking, a deep-seated belief that the self is the source of what is good, or at least can produce what is good. Now, these are not unusual pathologies. They are the universal content of the human proprium when the external overlay of performative goodness is no longer in place. No one is exempt. The question is only whether we are willing to have these things brought into the light of the Word. The awakening to this interior content is not a discovery that you are especially bad. It is the universal experience of anyone who takes the inner life seriously. What changes in phase 2 is not that these states are created, they were always there, but that they are no longer concealed. The work of phase 1 removed the exterior overlay that had masked them. With that mask down, reflective work can now reach what lies beneath. So the image of the lantern descending into this abyss captures this. It is the light of the Word moving into the depths of our inner life, casting light into places we had never looked. What it illuminates will include things that may frighten or shame us. But the light itself is never condemnatory. As John 3:17 says, God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. The purpose of the light is liberation. In these depths, we encounter two fundamentally different kinds of interior life, each tied to an opposing form of life, the infernal and developing heavenly propriums. So what we have here is a key diagnostic tool for phase 2. The word proprium refers to our sense of self, what we feel is most deeply and personally ours. What this matrix highlights are two different modes of life or kinds of proprium, one of a natural quality and the other of a spiritual quality. So what we see in this matrix is these two modes of life contrasted. And it's diagnostic because if we can recognize these differences, we then are given the ability to attend to what is opposed to a genuine spiritual mode of being. So just looking at the 4 rows here, beginning with the core source, what we see here is that the natural sense of self is rooted in the loves of self and the world. The spiritual sense of self is rooted in spiritual and heavenly loves, love to the Lord and the neighbor. Now, both feel equally like us from the inside, that is, subjectively. That's part of what makes discernment so difficult. If we look at the different acknowledgements of the divine, we see that the hellish proprial states deny the Lord, even if the lips profess otherwise. Heaven and Hell 506, subsection 2, puts it bluntly: acknowledging the divine and living an evil life are opposites. To know and not do is, from a spiritual perspective, denial. Genuine spiritual states acknowledge the Lord not just in word, but through an actual life of self-examination and repentance. The next row, outward presentation versus inward reality. We see here the hellish proprium maintains a moral exterior that conceals self-interest, the false acquisition of spiritual merit. The spiritual sense of self, in contrast, seeks to work to have its exteriors aligned with its interiors. And then finally, the different responses to truth. So this is perhaps the most practically useful diagnostic. Hellish proprial states, when confronted with truth, will immediately reject or distort it to justify the self. Spiritual states, when active, embrace truth as a mirror for repentance, not because it's comfortable, but because it genuinely desires to see what is opposed to what is heavenly. Now, the point is not to condemn one and celebrate the other, but to learn to see which is which. Discernment between the two forms of self is a core spiritual literacy skill in phase 2. But this encounter with the hellish proprium doesn't come without a characteristic trap, one that keeps many people cycling rather than progressing. So this slide addresses what may be the most common spiritual struggle in regenerative work, what we term in Logopraxis as the merit-guilt cycle. Now, when we begin spiritual practice, we come with a genuine desire to be better people. We engage sincerely, we try, and for a while things seem to go well. Then something happens. We find ourselves reacting in a way that reveals that the hellish proprium is alive and active. Could be anger, contempt, self-pity, a desire for revenge, all manner of negative emotion. We are dismayed. We feel we are failing, and that feeling of failure brings guilt, desolation, a sense of not being able to make the grade. And so we respond by resolving to try harder next time, to be better, and the cycle begins again. So the fundamental error underlying this cycle is the belief that the hellish proprium can be improved. And we are driven to try and improve it because we believe it is ourself. We believe that with sufficient effort and resolve, we can make it good. But the doctrines are unambiguous. The hellish proprium is nothing but evil and falsity. It cannot be turned into good any more than darkness can be turned into light by rearranging it. The problem isn't that it exists, it's that we take it to be us and believe that we can fix it. As long as we remain identified with what is hellish as ourself, we stay on a treadmill of self-improvement that, like all treadmills, takes us nowhere. What the word does is expose the proprium, brings it into clearer light, brings us to a place where we can see it for what it is. It is through that acknowledgement, not through effort to reform it, that the Lord can release us from our attachment to it. So the diagram on the right shows the alternative, metanoia, the Greek word for repentance, meaning literally a new mind or a new way of thinking. But notice the steps here. First, there needs to be an acknowledgement of the evil. We need to see it clearly and name it. Second step, we need to recognize it as hellish influx, not as me. It arises from the hells, not from that sense of self that the word offers us. Step 3, shun it as a sin against the Lord, not out of self-condemnation or self-pity, but out of a love for what is good and true. And 4, we're able then to receive the heavenly proprium. This the Lord implants as the hellish one is relinquished. So Logopraxis has an aphorism that captures this paradox perfectly. Your effort achieves nothing, but without effort, nothing is achieved. We cannot transform ourselves, but without a sincere effort to look, to see, to acknowledge, the Lord cannot work. Our work is to engage in self-examination and repentance. His work is to restructure our minds into a heavenly form. So when this disidentification from the hellish proprium takes hold, a remarkable process of spiritual sorting begins. When we act as of self to acknowledge and shun evils, something happens that is not of our making. The Lord, through the operation of the word, gathers the hellish states and separates them, drawing what is of heaven toward the center of our mind and casting what is of hell to the periphery. This is the mechanic of spiritual separation described in Heaven and Hell 511. Here we use a centrifuge metaphor. In a centrifuge, dense and light materials separate by spinning. In the spiritual centrifuge, what separates are the affections and thoughts of our inner life, those that are of a heavenly quality, that acknowledge the Lord, that align with truth, that express genuine charity. All these are drawn inward toward the core. Those that are of a hellish quality, self-seeking, denial of the divine, love of the world, and the love of self above all else, are cast outward to the periphery. Now, this does not mean that those hellish states disappear entirely. They remain at the periphery, ready to be stirred up, but their location shifts. They are no longer at the center, driving our life. The heavenly proprium moves toward the center and begins to organize the mind from there. Practically, this is experienced as a gradual change in what we find ourselves drawn toward and what we turn away from. Our attention increasingly goes to interior things, the quality of our thoughts and affections, our relationship to the Lord, and less to exterior things, reputation, status, the approval of others. The center of gravity of our life shifts. And this is not something we engineer. It is what happens when we faithfully engage in the practice the Word calls us to. And once this separation reaches a certain completion, the third state opens, and it is characterized by something quite different from the first two. The transition into the third state involves a change in the nature of the work. The first two states are primarily about clearing, stripping the exterior of false images, and sorting the interior loves. Phase 3 is about infilling and equipping for a truly heavenly life, of living for the whole. This phase is called the state of instruction. But notice immediately what kind of instruction. The quote from Heaven and Hell 517 is critical. Cognitions are not committed to memory, but to life. Heavenly instruction is not what happens in a classroom. It is what happens when truth is integrated into the actual fabric of who we are, into our will, our loves, our lived responses. The three-circle diagram provides a picture of what integrated instruction looks like. Truth from the word, affection or love, and use, action all come together in their intersection. When truth is loved and acted upon, it becomes life. When love is shaped by truth and expressed in use, it becomes charity. When action flows from truth and love, it becomes genuine spiritual use. The instruction of phase 3 is not generic. It is uniquely tailored to each person's disposition, their core loves, their particular form of mind. Heaven and Hell 513 tells us that instruction is given according to each spirit's disposition and faculty of reception. This means that the doctrine that comes to us through the practice of the word is not the same for everyone. It is the doctrine our life needs, shaped by who we are and who the Lord is forming us to be. Angelic minds are described as forms of charity. So one of the core capacities developed in this third state is what we call spiritual literacy. Spiritual literacy is the practical skill that emerges from sustained engagement with the Word in phases 1, 2, and 3. Think of it as a kind of grammar, the ability to read the language of your own mental states and distinguish between what belongs to the exterior world and what belongs to the interior world of the spirit. This cognitive shield diagram captures a profound principle from the work The Arcana Celestia 3721, which simply states, posterior things cannot flow into prior. The exterior natural world cannot actually flow into and determine the interior spiritual mind. It can only appear to do so. What is actually happening is that the interior mind is projecting outward and then reading its own projections as external causes. When we develop spiritual literacy, we begin to see through this appearance. Concretely, spiritual literacy involves 3 skills highlighted in the series of Heaven and Hell. The first is divided attention, that is, being able to observe one's interior state from truths from the Word, which forms a new spiritual or rational faculty while simultaneously engaging with the external sensory world without conflating the two. Second aspect of this skill, internal chatter observation. We notice the ongoing narrative of the mind, the stories we tell ourselves, the judgments we make, and recognizing when these reflect the self-interest of the proprium rather than the good that truths from the Word point to. And then there is the examination of motives, tracing our reactions back to their originating affections, asking honestly, is this response serving the self or serving the divine? These are not just abstract competencies. They are what allows us to maintain our interior life as genuinely interior, rather than being taken by reactions to every passing external event. The cognitive shield is built from the practice of truths. The ultimate destination of all this work is not some kind of personal spiritual achievement. It is something that serves a much more expansive vision. So we see here what perhaps captures the most important shift in the entire series. The shift that marks the beginning of phase 3 in its fullest sense. Up to and through phases 1 and 2, the primary orientation of the work has been inward. What is in me? What loves drive me? What is the quality of my thoughts and affections? This is necessary and it's foundational, and it cannot be skipped. But phase 3 marks a pivot. The center of gravity shifts from personal regeneration to the common good. The focus moves from what do I need to become to what is needed of me in service of others. Now, this is not a rejection of the previous inner work. It is its natural fruit. When the hellish proprium has been sufficiently separated from the center of our sense of self, what emerges is not a vacuum, but a love. And that love looks outward. It looks toward the spiritual well-being of others. It looks toward the Lord's ends, which is the salvation of the human race, or the regeneration of the human mind. So Heaven and Hell 517 describes how in the third state the Lord provides that everyone should love the uses suited to his particular disposition. So each person has a unique contribution, a form of service that flows naturally from who they are and how the Lord has formed them. This is not a burden. It is described as the source of deepest fulfillment. To find your use, to live it, to become it. So when individuals live their unique use within a community, something remarkable emerges. So Swedenborg describes heaven as being in the form of the grand human, the maximus homo, the human form maximized, a vast human form in which every angelic function combines in a way that spiritually mirrors every detail found in the physical complexity of human biological functioning. The community of heaven is not a collection of individuals doing their own thing. It is a living organism in which every member's functioning contributes to the benefit of the whole. So this image is not merely poetic. In Logopraxis, the life group, the small community of practitioners who share together in their practice of the word, is a microcosm of this. Each member brings their unique engagement with the word, their unique insights, their unique struggles. When these are shared with the intention of serving the group's common good, something emerges that none of them could have produced alone. A richer, more complex, more complete understanding of the word working in the human mind and life. A spiritual community is a network of interdependent functions or uses. When individual uses harmonize under the Lord's love, they form a larger human, heaven manifested on earth. This is a vision worth dwelling on, not an idealized, conflict-free community, but a genuine community of people committed to the same practice, willing to be honest with one another about what the word reveals in them, and looking for ways to support each other's spiritual process rather than their own comfort. Let's now look at the complete map, a synthesis of everything we have covered so far. So here we have the complete cartography, the whole map on one slide. So phase 1 of exteriors, the primary action is stripping the mask, exposing the discrepancy between who we present ourselves to be and what actually rules us. The state of the self is in the illusion of inherent goodness. We still believe our moral conduct means we are essentially good. The word functions here to reveal discrepancies between our self-image and our actual affections. Our spiritual orientation is primarily historical faith or a faith limited to the memory. What dominates is rule following and placing those rules on others. It's a way of making the grade earning merit. So we engage with religion from the outside in. Phase 2, state of interiors, the primary action is sorting the will, bringing the hellish proprium into light and beginning to have our sense of self separated from it. The state of self is the encounter with the hellish proprium. What was hidden beneath external masks that reinforced our sense of our own goodness is now visible. And it is not what we hoped. As we work with truths, the word functions as a centrifuge and judge. It actively separates what is of the Lord from what is not. Our orientation is internal temptation and struggle. Experientially, we are engaged in a genuine fight for the quality of our inner life. What's actually in play is that the Word, as the Lord, is fighting against the hells to liberate our sense of self from the infernal proprium. Phase 3, the state of instruction. The primary action is implanting into use. Truths become integrated into life. The state of the self is the reception of the heavenly proprium. A genuine sense of self grounded in what is of the Lord. The Word provides tailored doctrine for life, not generic teaching, but personalized formation. Our orientation shifts to outward focus and common good. The question is no longer just what do I need, but what can I give? And this brings us to our final slide. So the spiral, I think, is the right image for how this process actually feels in lived experience. So it's how we experience logopraxis, not a straight line, not a circle that returns to exactly the same place, but a spiral, cycling through the same themes at ever-deepening levels. In group life, we encounter exterior work, then interior work, then instruction. Then we return to exterior work at a new depth, and the spiral continues. So these states, whilst presented as linear and progressive in nature, are also cyclic in our experiences of them. Our regeneration and instruction is an eternal process, one that is always moving into deeper states of seeing what it is the Word as the Lord is offering us to see. So awakening is not a destination, it is a way of traveling. There is no point at which a person arrives and says, "Now I am fully awake." The angels themselves continue to receive influx, continue to be formed, continue to move more deeply into the love that is their life. And for us, each engagement with the Word, each moment of genuine practice, is another turn of the spiral, another increment of light. The text that frames the Logopraxis orientation is the opening of John's Gospel, as was read earlier. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was toward God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. This is where Logopraxis begins and where it always returns. The Word is the Lord is life, and that life is the light that illuminates the inner world of the human mind, showing us what is there, guiding us through what must be let go of, and leading us ever more deeply into what the Lord's love is building in us.